This week in our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast, we are looking at Revelation chapter 15 as we march through this particular book. In Revelation, we've come to a place where there was no chronological movement for a while. At the end of chapter 11, if you wanted to go back there, you find the seventh trumpet judgment that has been sounded, starting with verse 15. And there's some detail there, but the content of the seventh trumpet judgment is not given at that point. And then in chapters 12, 13, and 14, we have some other issues, some other information given that doesn't seem to advance the chronological narrative of the account. Then we come to chapter 15, and the chronology picks up. We start to move forward now in time as we're doing that. So it says in verse 15, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous." So he is going to see a sign. Matter of fact, Revelation chapter 15 has two visions that John sees. And the first one pertains to the tribulation saints. And that's what we'll look at here today. The first vision pertaining to the tribulation saints. So he sees this sign, and the seven angels who had the seven plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. So this is the final outpouring of the wrath of God in the tribulation period. We've already seen the trumpet judgments, and we've seen the seal judgments before that, and there was something called the thunder judgments that we have no content, no information about what those are. They're sealed up. And now we have the bowl judgments. These apparently are being poured out right at the very end of the tribulation. It's coming right to the very last weeks, perhaps, and so forth. And these are being poured out, and it says here, in them the wrath of God is finished. And so we're having this vision concerning these particular events that are going on, and they have to do with the wrath of God. And we're going to have a great worship service here that begins in verse 2. And it says here, "And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who have been victorious over the beast and his image, and the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, holding harps of God." And then we move into the worship service. But as we think about that, we see these victorious saints coming out of the tribulation. It's a little hard to know whether or not victorious means here that they escaped death and martyrdom and have come to the end of the tribulation without dying, or perhaps they were victorious in dying for the Lord and are with him, because we find him here, they're standing on the sea of glass holding harps of God. That's always a picture at other times of the people of God who are already with him in heaven. So that could be the case here, we don't know. This is probably where we get the idea that in heaven people play harps, which I don't think is the point he's saying here. He's going to have a musical service. He's going to have a worship in song, and harps are going to be used. The only other instrument mentioned in the book of Revelation is trumpets. So trumpets and harps are mentioned, but they're holding these harps. And so this is a vision concerning the tribulation saints. So let's back up before we go on and look at the worship service, and notice that it's wrapped around the wrath of God. And the wrath of God shows up a lot in these texts. Going back to chapter 14, verse 10, he says, he will also drink of the wine of the wrath of God. And then we have in this passage here, because in them the wrath of God is finished. And we go over to verse 7, we find the golden bowls full of the wrath of God. And then in chapter 16, verse 1, the seven bowls of the wrath of God. So we have the wrath of God predominant here as they begin to worship God. Some years ago when I was teaching through this material, I kind of challenged the people I was teaching about did they know of any songs that included the wrath of God as part of worship, because I was pretty much unaware of them. Someone sent me a song I've never heard of before, called "Send Down the Fire." And in that, the opening words go like this: "Send down the fire of your justice, send down the rains of your love, come send down the Spirit, breathe life in your people, and we shall be the people of God." I don't know too much about this song, but the first two lines of it are interesting. Send down the fire of your justice, send down the rains of your love. Do we worship God for his justice? Should we worship God because of his wrath? We worship God for His love. We worship God for His graciousness and for all sorts of things. But do we ever worship God because He's a God of justice and wrath? And yet that's what we find in the book of Revelation over and over, that the Lord is worshiped because He's a God of justice and He's bringing about perfect wrath upon the sins of those who reject Him. Now, you might want to think about that as we close out this first lesson in chapter 15. As we think about that, the wrath of God is part of who God is, and it's not a part to be despised. It's a part to be relished and understood, and God to be worshipped because of it. Well, we'll pick up the rest of this account next time. You have a wonderful day in the Lord.